The first rule of forensic accounting is to keep your face perfectly still, even when your blood is boiling. I stood there in my daughter's pristine white marble kitchen, a kitchen I knew she couldn't possibly afford, and stared at the man she'd married. Mark leaned against the $10,000 refrigerator, swirling a craft beer in his hand. He gestured with the bottle toward a magnificent piece of textile art hanging on the wall, a storm of woven blues and golds that had taken my Jenna 6 months to create. It was the only thing in the room with any soul. He gave me that slick, patronizing smile, the one he probably practiced in the mirror. "We're so proud of her little hobby," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Honestly, Carol, it's great she has something to keep her busy. But when it comes to the real money, the serious decisions," he paused, taking a slow sip of his beer before landing the final blow. "Well, that's best left to the grown-ups." The air went thin. I saw my daughter's face fall, that familiar flicker of shame he was so good at lighting in her eyes. He saw a quiet widow, a mother-in-law he could easily dismiss. He had no idea he'd just handed a loaded weapon to the one person who could expose every single lie he'd ever told. That explosion was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years, and I was about to bring the whole house down. To understand how we reached that breaking point, you have to go back to the phone call that started it all. That phone call started on a Tuesday, just as the afternoon sun was turning the Napa Hills to gold outside my office window. My desk is a testament to a life spent in pursuit of order. Pens are aligned, files are color-coded, and every number on my screen has to balance to the penny. It's a quiet life, a good life, one I'd built for my daughter Jenna, and me after her father David passed away. The screen lit up with her face, and for a second, my world felt perfectly in balance. She was glowing, her smile so wide it made her eyes crinkle. She was calling from her new kitchen, the one I'd only seen in pictures, a vast, sterile space of white marble and stainless steel that looked like it belonged in a magazine, not a home. "Mom, you are not going to believe this," she started, her voice a little too bright, a little too fast. "Mark's dad just called. Prestige Holdings is letting us in on something huge. Like, once-in-a-generation huge." I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "That's wonderful, honey. What kind of deal?" "It's a new commercial development, the Azure Point project," she said, reciting the name like she'd practiced it. "It's in that up-and-coming corridor just south of the city. Mark says it's a guaranteed home run. We just have to move fast to get in on the ground floor." I run the books for 3 of the most successful boutique wineries in this valley. I know what a real investment prospectus looks like. It's a dense, boring document filled with risk assessments, market analysis, and so many numbers. What I was hearing from my daughter were not numbers, they were buzzwords. Ground floor, up-and-coming corridor, guaranteed home run. These were the words salesmen used, not investors. "Wow," I said, keeping my voice even. "That sounds like a big step. What kind of capital are we talking about?" Jenna's smile tightened just a fraction. "Well, that's the amazing part. We're going to be majority partners. All we have to do is liquidate the trust." The trust. The word hit the air and hung there, heavy and cold. Suddenly, I wasn't in my sun-drenched office anymore. I was back in a stuffy lawyer's office 20 years ago, holding a 5-year-old Jenna's hand. I was watching my husband, David, sign the papers. He wasn't a wealthy man. He was a high school history teacher. To start that fund, he'd sold his one true love, a cherry red 1967 Ford Mustang he'd spent a decade restoring in our garage. I can still smell the oil and polish on his hands. He'd leaned down and whispered to Jenna, "This is your safety net, sweetie. No matter what, this will always be here to catch you." That trust wasn't a pile of money. It was the last promise her father ever made her. It was the physical manifestation of his love, built with sacrifice and foresight. I must have been quiet for too long because Jenna's face filled with concern. "Mom, are you there?" I blinked, forcing a smile back onto my face. "I'm here, honey. It's just a big decision. That's all. Have you seen the financials on the project?" "Well, Mark has. He's gone over everything. He says it's all rock solid." Just then, Mark slid into the frame behind her, a ghost appearing in the pristine kitchen. He wrapped his arms around Jenna's shoulders and beamed at the camera, all perfect teeth and expensive confidence. "Hey, Carol, heard the good news?" "Mark," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "Jenna was just telling me about Azure Point. Sounds exciting. Exciting doesn't even cover it, he said, squeezing Jenna's shoulders. This is the big one, the kind of deal that sets our family up for life. His family. Not hers, not theirs, his. I was just wondering about the specifics, I said, trying to sound casual. You know me, always curious about the numbers. What's the projected cap rate? Have you done a sensitivity analysis on the lease-up forecast? Mark chuckled, a smooth, dismissive sound. Whoa, slow down there, CPA. Don't you worry your head about all that boring stuff. That's what I'm here for. I handle the details so Jenna doesn't have to. He kissed the top of her head, a gesture that looked more like ownership than affection. Jenna just smiled, leaning into him, wanting so badly to believe in the fairy tale he was selling. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. David had built that trust so Jenna would never have to depend on a man who told her not to worry her head about her own life, her own money. He had built it so she would have her own power. And now, this smooth-talking boy was convincing her to hand that power over, all for a handful of buzzwords and a smile. I looked at my daughter, my brilliant, creative, trusting daughter, and I saw how much she wanted this perfect life he was promising. Arguing with her now would only drive her further into his corner. I had to be smart. I had to be careful. I had to be there. You know what? I said, forcing warmth into my voice. This is too big to talk about over a screen. I have some vacation days saved up. Why don't I fly out next week? We can celebrate properly. I'm dying to see the new house anyway. Jenna's face lit up with genuine joy. Really? You'd do that? Oh, that would be amazing. Mark's smile didn't change, but I saw a flicker in his eyes. He hadn't counted on me being on site. Of course, he said smoothly. The more the merrier. Great, I said. It's settled then. Oh, and honey, do me a favor and email me the prospectus for the deal when you get a chance. I'd just love to see what a once-in-a-generation opportunity looks like on paper. Of course, that prospectus never landed in my inbox. Instead, I got a series of texts from Mark filled with excuses about proprietary information and non-disclosure agreements, all wrapped in a cheerful digital bow. Lawyers, you know how it is. Can't wait to see you. Each word was a polite little door slamming in my face. It was all the confirmation I needed. A week later, my sensible carry-on was rolling across the ridiculously oversized tiles of their foyer. The house was even colder in person. It wasn't a home, it was a statement. Everything was a shade of gray or white, with sharp angles and furniture that looked like it would be angry if you actually sat on it. It smelled like wealth. A faint, clean, chemical scent with no trace of food or life. As Jenna gave me the tour, I saw a letter with a red overdue stamp on the kitchen island, but before I could get a clear look, Mark swooped in, smiling, and casually slid a stack of design magazines over it. He didn't miss a beat. He was good. Too good. That evening, they were hosting a neighborhood potluck. It was their turn, Mark explained, to contribute to the community spirit. In my town, a potluck means crock-pots, mismatched serving spoons, and someone's famous 7-layer dip. Here, it meant catered platters of sushi and a bartender pouring expensive, oaky Chardonnays. I'd spent the morning in Jenna's cavernous kitchen baking a rustic sourdough loaf. It was my specialty, a recipe I'd perfected over years, using a starter I'd nurtured for almost a decade. As I worked the dough, I thought of my late husband, David. He used to say that you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by whether they brought something they'd bought or something they'd made. One was a transaction, the other was a gift. My loaf, with its dark, crackling crust and soft, chewy inside, was a gift. I placed it on a beautiful wooden board next to a small pot of honey butter. A few minutes later, Mark's mother, Beatrice, drifted over. She was a tall, painfully thin woman in a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my mortgage payment. Her smile was a perfect, paper-thin curve. "Carol, darling, is this your creation?" she cooed, tapping the crust with a perfectly manicured nail. "How wonderfully rustic." "It's an old family recipe," I said simply. "Charming," she replied, the word landing with the weight of a dismissal. She picked up the entire board, and for a moment, I thought she was going to feature it. Instead, she walked it over to the far end of the buffet table, behind a mountain of quinoa salad. She then replaced it with a store-bought baguette, pre-sliced and sweating in a plastic basket, which she placed in the center of the table. The move was so slick, so seamless, most people wouldn't have even noticed the quiet little demotion. But I noticed. It was a message, as clear as any line item on a balance sheet. You are not one of us. What you bring has no value here. The rest of the evening was a blur of similar faces. Men in crisp polo shirts talking about golf handicaps and stock tips, women with identical highlights and designer sneakers discussing their Peloton stats. They talked about money constantly, but never in terms of work. It was all about investments, portfolios, and what their money was doing for them, as if it were an employee they sent out into the world. David would have called them ghosts living in ghost houses. I watched Jenna navigate this world, a translated version of herself. She laughed a little too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. She praised a neighbor's bland, store-bought cheesecake with the enthusiasm she usually reserved for a masterpiece. Mark stayed attached to her side, his hand always on the small of her back, less a gesture of affection and more a gesture of management. Then came the moment that froze the evening into a sharp, ugly photograph in my mind. A neighbor, a friendly enough man named Tom, was admiring Jenna's textile art on the wall. "Wow, Jenna, this is incredible work," he said, genuinely impressed. "You've got a real talent." Jenna blushed, a rare, authentic moment. "Thank you, Tom. It's my passion." Before she could say another word, Mark clapped Tom on the shoulder, steering him away. "She's amazing, isn't she?" he boomed, his voice carrying across the patio. "Jenna gets that incredible creative side from her mom." He winked at me across the crowd, a gesture of inclusion that felt like a slap. "Thank God," he continued, turning his full attention back to Tom. "She got my family's business sense. Otherwise, we'd be living in a gallery full of unsold art instead of a place like this." The laughter that followed was light, but it felt like rocks hitting glass. I saw my daughter's shoulders tighten. I saw the blush of pleasure curdle into a flush of shame. She tried to smile it away, to pretend it was just a joke, but I saw the light in her eyes dim. He hadn't just insulted her, he'd publicly framed her passion as a financial liability, a childish whim that his family's so-called business sense had to rescue her from. He was rendering her worthless in her own home, in front of her own friends. I wanted to walk over there, to stand in front of that arrogant boy and tell him that the integrity and passion Jenna put into one thread of her art was worth more than his entire hollow inheritance. I wanted to tell him that my husband built a legacy for his daughter with his own two hands, not by leveraging other people's money. But I didn't. I just stood there, my glass of water cold in my hand, and I watched. Because a good accountant doesn't argue with the numbers. She just observes them, records them, and waits for the right moment to present the audit. And I was witnessing an audit of character, a deep and troubling deficit. He thought it was just a harmless joke at a party. What he couldn't possibly understand was that he'd just confirmed every suspicion and given me all the justification I needed to find out exactly how deep his family's deficit went. That night, sleep was a stranger. I lay in the guest room bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence in that house was different from the quiet I was used to. My silence in Napa was peaceful, earned. This was the empty silence of a museum, a place where everything was for show. The memory of Mark's condescending laugh and my daughter's pained smile played on a loop in my mind. He hadn't just made a joke, he'd tried to write a line item in the ledger of my daughter's life, classifying her passion under miscellaneous hobbies, an asset with zero value. I slipped out of bed and opened my laptop, the screen a lonely blue light in the darkness. I didn't open my work files or start digging into Mark's finances. Not yet. Instead, I opened a simple spreadsheet program and stared at the blank, gridded page. The neat columns, the perfect lines, they were a comfort. And suddenly, the silent, chilly guest room dissolved, and I was 20 years younger, sitting at a wobbly kitchen table that smelled faintly of cheap wood polish. The apartment was small, the kind of place you rent when your world has shrunk down to the size of survival. David was gone, taken by an illness that had been as swift as it was cruel. I was 35 years old, with a mountain of medical bills, a 5-year-old daughter asleep on the worn-out floral couch, and a future that looked like a blank page with no numbers on it. By day, I worked as a waitress at the Greystone Diner. By night, after my shift, the owner, a kind old man named Sal, would let me do his books for an extra $50 a week. That night, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the soft murmur of a late-night talk show on the tiny television. On the table, under the tired yellow glow of a single lamp, sat my entire world. To my left was a stack of community college textbooks, their pages filled with my desperate highlighter scrawls, Principles of Accounting, Intro to Corporate Finance. To my right was Sal's ledger. It was a heavy green cloth-bound book, and I loved it. I loved the crisp feel of the paper, the perfect faint blue lines, the way my pen would click as I made my entries. Every number had a home. Every credit had a debit. It was a world of perfect, logical balance, a stark contrast to the chaos of my own life. I remember the bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that settles in your marrow. My back ached from my shift, my eyes burned from staring at the numbers, and the coffee in my mug was my third and had long since gone cold. I looked over at Jenna, her small body curled under an Afghan my mother had made. Her breathing was the softest, most reassuring sound in the universe. Everything I was doing, this impossible balancing act, was for her. My eyes drifted to the only photo I had on the table, a faded snapshot of David leaning against his 1967 Ford Mustang. That car. It had been his masterpiece. He'd bought it as a wreck from a junkyard and spent every spare weekend for a decade bringing it back to life. I could still conjure the smell of his garage gasoline, wax, and his singular focus. He wasn't a man of grand pronouncements, but that car was his poem. It was the color of a Bing cherry, with a white leather interior he'd stitched himself. When he finally got it running, he took Jenna and me for a drive up the coast, the wind in our hair, the radio playing too loud. He was so proud. Not of the car, I realized later, but of the fact that he had taken something broken and made it whole and beautiful through sheer force of will. A year later, when the first diagnosis came, he sold it. He didn't even hesitate. A collector from the city came, a man with a blank checkbook and no soul in his eyes. David just handed him the keys, his face calm. The money from that sale, every last dime, was what he used to start Jenna's trust fund. "It's a foundation, Carol," he'd told me, his voice raspy from his treatments. "Something solid for her to stand on, so no one can ever pull the rug out from under her." He had sold his poem to build her a foundation. And now, his son-in-law, a man who had never built anything in his life, was trying to sell that foundation to pay for a ghost. A wave of fury, so pure and hot it almost made me dizzy, washed over me there in the dark of that memory. I looked at the ledger again, at the neat columns where I meticulously tracked Sal's inventory, so many pounds of coffee, so many dozens of eggs. It was honest work, real value. You could touch it, taste it. What Mark was doing was the opposite. He was creating illusions with words, moving imaginary assets around to hide a deficit. He was a bookkeeper of lies. I got up from the wobbly kitchen table and walked over to the couch. I knelt and gently brushed the hair from Jenna's forehead. She stirred in her sleep, a little sigh escaping her lips. I felt a promise rise in me, a vow so fierce it was a physical force. It was a promise to my daughter, and a promise to the memory of my husband. I would not let his sacrifice be turned into collateral for some con man's failing empire. I would not let my daughter's foundation be shattered. I went back to the table, picked up my pen, and in the margin of my textbook I wrote down a plan, a list of steps. It started with getting my degree, then getting my license, building a business, being so good with numbers that I could see the story they were telling, even the stories people tried to hide. Back in the present, I looked at my reflection in the dark laptop screen. The face looking back at me was older, with more lines around the eyes, but the determination was the same. The rage was the same. The promise was the same. The woman in that memory, the one with nothing but cheap coffee and a promise to keep, she was still here, and she was about to audit her son-in-law's life down to the studs. An audit begins with a single question. My question, posed the next morning over coffee, was cloaked in motherly concern. Mark had already left for the office in a cloud of expensive cologne, leaving behind the hollow echo of his presence. Jenna was sketching in a notebook at the vast dining room table, the morning light catching the worried little line between her brows. "Honey," I began, setting a mug down for her. "I was thinking about what you said, about the trust. It's a big move, and I think it would be smart for you to have a really clear picture of your own financial health before you merge everything, just so you know where you stand." She looked up, sighing. "I know, Mom. I should be better with this stuff. It's just, Mark is so good at it, and my brain just fogs over when I see all those numbers." That's what he's counting on, I thought, but I said, "It's not as complicated as it looks. How about we just take an hour this morning and organize things? We can link your accounts, categorize your spending, make a simple budget. It'll be our little project." She agreed, more to appease me, I think, than out of any real desire to look at her finances. We sat side by side at that polished slab of mahogany, a table meant for state dinners, and I opened my laptop. I used the same professional accounting software I use for my winery clients, a program that could ingest years of financial data and spit out a clear, elegant story. That's all a balance sheet is, really. A story. And I was about to read my son-in-law's. Jenna logged into her online banking portal. The first thing I noticed was that it wasn't her account. It was a joint account. Mark had insisted on it, she explained, right after they got married. "For transparency," he'd said. I felt a chill. In my world, that word often meant the exact opposite. I linked the account, and the data began to flow, populating the software with thousands of tiny transactions. A river of their life, quantified. For 20 minutes, the story was painfully normal, a diorama of upper-middle-class American life, an endless stream of charges from Whole Foods, Amazon, Nordstrom. A car payment for a ridiculously expensive German SUV. Property taxes. Venmo payments to a dog walker. I categorized them patiently, my fingers flying across the keyboard, creating a neat, orderly picture of their cash flow. Jenna was starting to relax, seeing the mess of her spending turn into clean, understandable charts. But I was also seeing something else. I was seeing the balance of the trust fund, which was also linked to the account, steadily decreasing, and I was seeing what it was being spent on. David sold his Mustang to build a foundation for his daughter. That money, his sweat and sacrifice, was now paying for Mark's $500 golf shirts, his weekly steakhouse dinners with clients, his fantasy football league buy-in. Each transaction was a tiny desecration. I saw a charge for a custom-tailored suit, and I felt a flash of memory. David, in his worn-out jeans, grease under his fingernails, carefully sanding a piece of chrome trim for his car, a look of pure, focused joy on his face. The contrast was so sharp it felt like a physical pain in my chest. I kept my face neutral, a mask of calm efficiency. I was just the bookkeeper, just organizing. And then I saw it. It wasn't a huge, glaring error. It was quiet, deceptive. A recurring monthly payment of $12,500. The recipient was listed simply as 818 Properties, LLC. The transaction description was a single, vague word: services. My pulse quickened, but my hand remained steady on the mouse. $12,500, not a round number. An amateur move to make it look like a real, invoiced payment. But the LLC name was the tell. It was generic, numbered, anonymous. It was the kind of name you give a company when you don't want anyone to know what it is or who owns it. It was a shell. I moved the cursor and highlighted the line. "What's this one, sweetie?" I asked, my voice as casual as if I were asking about a grocery run. 818 Properties? Is that a contractor for the house? Jenna leaned closer to the screen, squinting. "Oh, that," she said, recognition dawning. "That's one of Mark's things. He and his dad have a bunch of holding companies for their different projects. He said it was just cleaner for their corporate accounting to run some of the management fees through our personal account. Something about tax advantages." She shrugged, already losing interest. "It's all way over my head." It wasn't over my head. It was a blatant violation of basic accounting principles. No legitimate company runs corporate management fees through a junior partner's personal bank account. That wasn't a tax advantage. It was a textbook way to hide money, to move it from one place to another without a clear paper trail. It was a lie, dressed up in financial jargon she wouldn't understand. He was using her, and her father's legacy, as a laundromat. "I see," I said, and clicked a button, categorizing the payment under a new heading I created: questionable. Icings. I spent another half hour with her, finishing our project. I showed her the colorful pie charts the software generated, pointing out how much they spent on dining out. She was fascinated, feeling for the first time like she had a handle on her own life. She had no idea that beneath the surface of those pretty charts, I had just discovered a sinkhole. When we were done, I closed my laptop, the quiet click echoing in the cavernous room. "See?" I said, smiling at my daughter. "Not so scary after all." "You're amazing, Mom," she said, hugging me. "I feel so much better, so much more in control." The irony was a bitter pill. She felt in control because I had shown her a map, but I was the only one who could see that a huge part of that map was labeled with the ancient warning, "Here be dragons." She went back to her studio, humming, feeling empowered. I stayed at the dining room table, the ghost of the numbers still burned onto my retinas. He had made a mistake. In his arrogance, he assumed no one would ever look. He assumed the numbers would just be a fog my daughter would never want to navigate, but he'd left a breadcrumb, a name and a number. 818 Properties, LLC. For a fraud, it was sloppy. For an investigator, it was a starting point. And there is nothing in this world I am better at than pulling on a thread to unravel a lie. That thread I started pulling, 818 Properties, LLC, was attached to a bigger, uglier knot than I could have imagined. For the next 3 days, while Jenna was at her studio and Mark was out playing real estate mogul, I turned their quiet, sun-filled dining room into a war room. My nights were a deep dive into a digital labyrinth of public records, incorporation documents, and property tax databases. The company was registered to a P.O.N.S. box, owned by another company, which was owned by a trust. But the men behind the curtain always get sloppy. I found Arthur's name on a single, old permit filing. That was all I needed. The knot was beginning to loosen. My days, however, required a performance, and on Saturday night we had a command performance at the annual Children's Hospital Foundation Gala. The ballroom of the downtown hotel was a glittering cavern of manufactured importance. The air, thick with the scent of 1,000 competing perfumes, vibrated with the sound of forced laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes. Men in tuxedos that strained slightly at the waist stood in tight circles, while women in jewel-toned gowns eyed each other's jewelry with the precision of auctioneers. It was a perfectly orchestrated illusion of charity and class, and it made my skin crawl. Beatrice was in her element, gliding through the room like a queen in her court, while Arthur stood beside her, accepting backpats and handshakes with the quiet authority of a man who believes he owns the world. Jenna looked beautiful in a simple blue dress, but she also looked like a visitor from another planet. She clutched her small evening bag with both hands, as if it were a life raft. I knew this wasn't her world. David and I had raised her on PTA fundraisers, the kind held in a noisy school gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and baked ziti. Our idea of a donation was buying a book of raffle tickets or bidding on a lopsided ceramic mug her teacher had made. That was community. This was commerce, a marketplace where status was bought and sold under the guise of helping sick children. We took our seats at the Prestige Holdings table, a prime piece of real estate right next to the stage. During the dinner, the auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a spray tan, began the main event. When the paddle raise for a new pediatric oncology wing was announced, Arthur raised his paddle for the $50,000 level. The auctioneer boomed his thanks, the company logo flashed on the giant screens, and a polite wave of applause washed over the room. Beatrice inclined her head graciously, accepting the praise as her due. I did the math in my head, $50,000. It was 4 months of the fraudulent management fees they were siphoning out of my daughter's account. They weren't donating their money, they were donating Jenna's. They were using her father's legacy, the money from his cherry-red Mustang, to buy themselves a round of applause. The piece of salmon on my fork suddenly tasted like ash. Later, as a string quartet played a soulless version of a pop song, a woman with a press badge and a hungry smile made a beeline for our table. She was a society columnist for a local magazine. "Arthur, Beatrice, you're looking fabulous as always," she gushed. Then she turned to Jenna, her eyes lighting up with genuine recognition. "And Jenna, I saw your piece at the McColl Center last month. Woven Storm. It was absolutely breathtaking. For the first time all night, I saw my daughter relax. A real, unforced smile spread across her face. Her hands unclenched from her purse. She was being seen. For herself. For her work. Thank you so much," Jenna said, her voice full of warmth. "That piece means so much to me. I was trying to capture the feeling of, oh, isn't she just wonderful?" Beatrice's voice cut through Jenna's sentence as smoothly and sharply as a diamond cutting glass. She leaned forward, placing a proprietary hand on Jenna's arm, and gave the columnist her paper-thin smile. She gets that artistic flair from her mother's side. We're so proud of her little crafts, they keep her so busy." The columnist's smile faltered, unsure of how to react to the backhanded compliment. Beatrice didn't pause. She looked the woman dead in the eye and delivered the killing blow. "Of course it's the men of this family who make the real contributions." The words landed in the center of the table with a sickening, silent thud. The journalist, a professional at navigating awkwardness, offered a tight smile and quickly excused herself. No one spoke. In the space her words had cleared, the sound of the string quartet seemed painfully loud. I watched Jenna's face. The light that had been there moments before was gone, extinguished. Her smile was gone. Her shoulders, which had been straight with pride, slumped forward. She picked up her water glass, her hand trembling slightly, and took a long, slow sip, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. She was disappearing before my very eyes, trying to make herself so small she would simply vanish. Mark, sitting beside her, just gave her knee a little pat, a gesture that said, There, just take it." He was complicit in her erasure. I locked eyes with Beatrice across the table. I said nothing. I didn't have to. My stare was cold, hard, and full of a promise I knew she was too arrogant to understand. She simply arched a perfectly plucked eyebrow and took a delicate sip of her wine, completely unbothered. She had asserted the family hierarchy, put the little artist back in her place, and restored what she saw as the natural order of things. But I saw it for what it was. It wasn't just a cruel insult, it was a strategy. They had to diminish her, to define her as a flighty, creative child with a hobby, because it justified their narrative that she needed to be managed. It justified them taking control of her finances, her future, her father's legacy. They weren't just stealing her money. They were methodically, cruelly, and publicly stealing her self-worth. They bought their applause with my daughter's inheritance and paid for it with her soul. And in that moment, as I watched Jenna trying to compose herself, I decided the price of admission to their perfect, glittering world was about to go up, way up. The price of admission to their world went up the moment I sat down at that dining room table after the gala. The house was dark and silent, the scent of Beatrice's expensive perfume still lingering in the air. They were upstairs, sleeping the sound, untroubled sleep of the morally bankrupt. I was wide awake. The public humiliation at the party hadn't broken me, it had focused me. It had turned my simmering anger into a cold, sharp tool. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating a single, neatly organized folder on my desktop. The thread I had found, 818 Properties, LLC, was waiting. It was time to pull it until everything unraveled. My first stop was the North Carolina Secretary of State website, a place of public record where every legitimate business must plant its flag. I typed in the name. The search results were instantaneous. There it was, a domestic limited liability company, incorporated 3 years ago. The registered agent? The person legally responsible for the company? Arthur Kensington, Mark's father? His name on the screen was the first concrete link, the first nail fastening my theory to fact. The address listed was just a P.O. box at a UPS store downtown. A classic move for someone who wants to create distance between themselves and their business, but they always have to list a real person. It's the law. With Arthur's name now officially tied to the shell company, I moved to the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds. Government websites are notoriously clunky, a digital maze of tiny fonts and confusing links, but they are my natural habitat. I searched for any properties owned by 818 properties. Nothing. A dead end. But that was expected. The shell company wasn't for holding assets. It was for moving money. So I switched tactics. I searched for any properties owned by Arthur or Prestige Holdings in the last 5 years. The list that populated the screen was long. Commercial lots, office buildings, residential developments, they had their fingers in a lot of pies. I started clicking through them one by one, cross-referencing addresses with news articles from the local business journal's online archives. Most of it was legitimate, boring stuff. Then I found it. A glowing article from 2 years ago announcing a new luxury golf course community, Cypress Creek Estates. The article featured a picture of Arthur and Mark, smiling in hard hats, promising a new era of luxury living. The developer listed on the project? A subsidiary of Prestige Holdings. I kept digging. The initial flurry of press was followed by a long, deep silence. A project this big doesn't just go quiet. A new search, this time on the county court docket, gave me the answer. I searched for civil suits filed against the Cypress Creek subsidiary. The screen filled with a list of names: Archer Concrete, Piedmont Electrical Supply, Carolina Landscaping. They were all contractors, the kind of small, family-owned businesses that are the backbone of any construction project. And they had all filed mechanics liens against the property for non-payment. A lien is a debt collector's atomic bomb. It means you haven't just missed an invoice. You've refused to pay for work that has already been done, for materials that have already been delivered. It attaches itself to the deed of the property like a parasite, making it impossible to sell or refinance until the debt is paid. Cypress Creek Estates wasn't just quiet, it was a corpse, rotting under a mountain of debt. And 818 Properties, LLC, was the financial vehicle they were using to quietly and illegally try to keep it on life support, siphoning money from other sources like my daughter's trust fund to pay off the angriest creditors and keep the whole thing from collapsing into a full-blown lawsuit. My heart was pounding, a cold, steady drumbeat of rage. This was the business sense Mark was so proud of. Not building but bleeding. Not investing but embezzling. There was one last piece. The once-in-a-generation opportunity. The Azure Point Project. I went back to the county property database and searched the new name. A single parcel of land appeared, the one they had shown Jenna in their glossy, fake prospectus. I pulled up the satellite view. Then I pulled up the satellite view for the Cypress Creek property. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same land. The same gentle curve of the access road. The same patch of woods by the highway. They hadn't found a new opportunity. They had just put a new name on their biggest failure. With a final, trembling click, I pulled the official property record for Azure Point. And there it was, a cascade of digital PDF documents, each with the official stamp of the county clerk, Lien. A federal tax lien from the IRS for unpaid payroll taxes, a lien from the concrete supplier, a lien from the electricians. The property wasn't just in trouble. It was radioactive, a financial black hole so deep no legitimate investor would ever touch it. They were planning to throw my daughter's inheritance, the last sacred promise from her father, into that black hole. Not to build something new, but in the desperate, pathetic hope that it might save them from their own catastrophic failures. I leaned back in the cold, hard dining room chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the room. The silence of the house was absolute. It was all there. A perfect interlocking architecture of lies, built on a foundation of arrogance and greed. They hadn't just made a bad investment. They had committed, calculated, predatory fraud. And they had used my daughter's heart as collateral. They thought they were building an empire. They had no idea they were just building my case. My case was built. Every fraudulent transfer, every shell corporation, every lie was now a neat, dated PDF in a folder on my laptop, a digital house of cards ready for a single puff of wind to bring it all down. For 2 days, I did nothing. I was a guest again. I drank coffee with my daughter, complimented her on her work, and made pleasant small talk with my son-in-law. I was an actress playing the part of the blissfully ignorant mother-in-law, and I was waiting. An animal like Mark, when cornered by his own failures, doesn't retreat. He doubles down, he gets greedier. I knew the next move was coming. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, with a summons. "Dad wants to have a chat with us in his office," Mark announced, his tone a practiced blend of casualness and gravity. "Just a quick family meeting about the project." Arthur's home office was everything I expected it to be. It was a dark, cold room, paneled in mahogany, smelling of old leather and entitlement. A massive desk, as big as a boat, separated him from the world. He sat behind it in a high-backed leather chair, a king on his throne. Mark took a chair beside him, instantly becoming a prince consort. Jenna and I were directed to 2 smaller, less comfortable chairs facing them, the supplicants. The setup was intentional, a stage designed to make us feel small, to remind us who held the power. Arthur began with a heavy sigh, steepling his fingers under his chin. He looked at Jenna, his expression one of paternalistic concern. "Jenna," he began, his voice a low, somber rumble. "As you know, opportunities like Azure Point come with certain complexities. We've been navigating some unexpected market headwinds." I felt a muscle in my jaw tighten. Headwinds. That's what he called. A dozen angry contractors and an IRS lien. I kept my face as still as a frozen lake. There's been a slight shift in the financing landscape, Mark chimed in, leaning forward eagerly. Our primary lender has adjusted their collateral requirements for the next phase of capital release. It's standard procedure for a project of this scale. Standard procedure. Another lie. It was the procedure for a project so risky the bank was threatening to pull the plug entirely. They were speaking in a language of pure fiction, a corporate fantasy designed to obscure the simple, ugly truth. They were out of money. Arthur nodded gravely. What this means is, for the good of the family's future, for the security of this investment, we need to show a bit more strength on our balance sheet. We need to pull together. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. Then, he slowly, deliberately, slid a thin, leather-bound folder across the polished surface of the desk. It stopped directly in front of Jenna. "This is just a temporary measure," Arthur said, his voice softening into a near whisper. "A simple bridge loan to get us over this final hurdle. Once the next phase is funded, we can unwind it immediately. It's a no-risk proposition." Jenna stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. Hesitantly, she opened it. Inside was a stack of papers, dense with legal text. On top was a document from a national bank. I could read the title from across the desk, Home Equity Line of Credit Application. My breath caught. I knew, even before I saw the address, which home it was for. It was the house David and I had bought when Jenna was 3, the small yellow bungalow with the big oak tree in the front yard. The house where I could still see the faint pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe, measuring her height year after year. The house where David had taught her to ride a bike on the cracked driveway, his hand steady on the back of the seat until, suddenly, he let go and she was flying on her own. It wasn't an asset. It wasn't a number on a balance sheet. It was the repository of her entire childhood, the last physical piece of her father that was left in the world. Jenna's face went pale. My house?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The house Dad left me?" "It's just collateral, babe," Mark said quickly, his voice a little too soothing. "The bank won't even touch it. It's just a formality to show them we're serious. We're all in this together, remember?" She looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning sense of violation. This was a line she had never imagined they would cross. Then her eyes darted to me, a desperate, silent plea for help, for guidance, for an answer. I held her gaze. My internal monologue was a roaring fire, screaming at me to stand up, to throw the folder in their smug faces, to expose every last one of their lies right there and then. But I didn't. That would have been my victory, not hers. David had taught her to ride that bike by letting go. It was time for me to do the same. So, I did nothing. I just looked at my daughter, my face calm, my eyes steady, and I gave her the slightest, most imperceptible nod. A nod that didn't say yes or no. It said, "You know the answer. Trust yourself." Jenna looked back down at the papers. She traced the edge of the application with her finger. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Arthur and Mark waited, their faces expectant, confident they had her cornered. Finally, she closed the folder. She slid it back to the center of the desk. "I need to think about it," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. It was the bravest thing I had ever heard. The shift in the room was immediate. The paternal warmth vanished from Arthur's face, replaced by a flash of cold annoyance. Mark's easy smile tightened at the edges. They had expected immediate compliance. They had not expected a will that was not their own. As we stood up to leave, Mark put his arm around Jenna's shoulders, pulling her close. "It's the right thing to do, babe," he whispered, his voice low and laced with a new, harder edge. "Don't let your mom's negativity get in your head." He called it negativity. I called it the truth. He had just tried to steal the last piece of her father's memory, the last sanctuary of her past, to pay for their fraudulent future. The meeting was over. The investigation was over. All that was left to do was schedule the audit. I scheduled the audit for Thursday at 10 a.m. I didn't ask for a meeting. I sent a calendar invitation from my professional email account. The subject line was cold and formal. Urgent meeting regarding the Azure Point investment. The location was set for Arthur's home office. I was going to dismantle their empire in the very room they had built to worship their own power. They were all there when Jenna and I arrived, arranged in the same positions as before. Arthur behind his throne of a desk, Mark and Beatrice in their chairs beside him. Their annoyance was a palpable force in the room. They looked at me as if I were a persistent insect they were about to swat. "Carol," Arthur began, his voice heavy with impatience. "I hope this is important. We are in the middle of a very sensitive negotiation." "I'm sure you are," I said, my voice even and calm. I placed my laptop on the corner of his desk. "This won't take long. I've completed my review of the investment, and I've prepared a brief presentation." Mark let out a short, condescending laugh. "A presentation? What is this, a PTA meeting?" I ignored him, connecting an HDMI cable from my laptop to the massive 80-inch television mounted on the wall behind them. Their faces, reflected in the dark screen, looked back at me, distorted and smug. With a click of the mouse, the screen flickered to life. My first slide was simple, with a clean corporate logo I had designed myself. It just said, "A forensic audit of the Azure Point opportunity, prepared by C. Davis, CPA." I saw Mark's smirk falter. He hadn't known I was a CPA. He just thought I was a mom who baked bread. "As we know," I began, my voice the same professional, dispassionate tone I used with my winery clients. The Azure Point project was presented as a new development. However, public property records show the parcel of land is identical to a previous development, Cypress Creek Estates. I clicked to the next slide. A satellite image of the property appeared on the left. Beside it, an identical image. The names were typed in a clean, bold font underneath each. A low murmur came from Beatrice. Mark's face went rigid. Arthur just stared, his eyes narrowing. "The primary financial vehicle for this project appears to be a holding company, 818 Properties, LLC, I continued, advancing the slide. A screenshot from the Secretary of State's website filled the screen. Arthur's name and signature were on the incorporation document, circled in red. "Registered to you, Arthur, 3 years ago." "This is highly irregular, Carol," Arthur said, his voice a low growl. "You're accessing private family information." "Huh." "This is all public record, Arthur," I replied without looking at him. "Now let's talk about cash flow." The next slide was a flowchart. It was simple, elegant, and utterly devastating. On the left, a box labeled Jenna's Trust Fund. On the right, a box labeled Cypress Creek Estates, defunct. In the middle, a box for 818 Properties, LLC. A thick red arrow showed monthly payments of $12,500 moving from Jenna's account into the shell company. Another arrow showed money flowing out of the shell company to a list of creditors. "For the past 28 months, I stated, funds have been systematically transferred from a personal joint account and funneled through this shell corporation. The funds were not used for investment in a new project. They were used to service the outstanding debt on a failing one." "Now you listen here," Mark sputtered, half rising from his chair. "This is a complex financial arrangement. You don't understand." "I understand that the legal term for this—" I cut him off, my voice dropping, becoming as cold and hard as steel, "is wire fraud." The words hit the air and hung there, deadly and sharp. Beatrice gasped. Mark sank back into his chair, his face the color of chalk. Arthur's composure finally cracked. His hands gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. I clicked to the final slide, and that brings us to the issue of collateral. The screen filled with a list. At the top, in large, bold letters, it said, "Active liens filed against parcel, #7895B, Mecklenburg County." Below it was a list of scanned official court documents. Each one was a testament to their failure. Archer Concrete, $1.2 million, filed August 2024. Piedmont Electrical Supply, $780,000, filed October 2024. Carolina Landscaping, $415,000, filed November 2024. I let each document linger on the screen for a moment before clicking to the next. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the television. "And the most recent filing," I said, clicking one last time. The seal of the Internal Revenue Service appeared on the screen. "A federal tax lien for $2.3 million in unpaid payroll taxes, filed 6 weeks ago." I turned from the screen to face them. Their arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly face of fear. Beatrice looked utterly lost, her world of charity galas and cashmere sweaters dissolving into a nightmare of numbers she couldn't comprehend. Mark was staring at his father, his expression that of a terrified child. And Arthur. Arthur looked like a man who had just watched his entire life burn to the ground. I picked up a thick, spiral-bound report from the desk. It was a printed copy of my audit, complete with every document, every screenshot, every irrefutable fact. I placed it gently in front of Arthur. "That is my report," I said quietly. "There are 2 copies. That one is yours." I paused, letting them absorb the implication. "The other is in a stamped, addressed envelope ready to be sent to the IRS and the U.S. Attorney's Office." I looked at each of them one by one. "You have 24 hours to return every penny you took from my daughter's trust, plus a 5% interest penalty for the fraudulent use of her capital. You will also sign a legal document, which my lawyer is drafting as we speak, relinquishing any and all claims to her assets, present and future, including the house her father left her. If those conditions are met by 10 a.m. tomorrow, the second copy of that report will be shredded. If not, it goes in the mail." There was no shouting, no crying. There was just the quiet, undeniable weight of the truth. Their power was built on a story they told themselves, a story of their own untouchable importance. And with a few simple facts, I had turned that story to dust. Jenna and I stood up. We walked out of that cold, dark room, leaving the 3 of them sitting in stunned silence, staring at their crimes displayed in high definition on their own television screen. We walked out of that room and didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. The truth, once it's been properly documented, is a silent, heavy thing. Jenna's hand found mine as we walked down the long, cold hallway. Her fingers were trembling, but her grip was strong. We were no longer guests in their house. We were witnesses who had just delivered a verdict. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in quiet tension. I helped Jenna pack. Not everything, just the essentials. Her clothes, her books, the worn-out photo of her father she kept on her nightstand. Most importantly, we packed her studio. We carefully wrapped every sculpture, every loom, every spool of precious thread. Each item we placed in a box felt like an act of liberation, a piece of her soul we were reclaiming from their cold, sterile house. Mark and his parents were ghosts. We heard their frantic, muffled voices from behind the closed door of Arthur's office. We saw them pass in the hallways, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes avoiding ours. The arrogance had been replaced by the acrid smell of fear. They were trapped in the prison of my report, the walls closing in. I watched the clock. They had until 10 a.m. I admit, a small dark part of me almost hoped they would miss the deadline. I wanted them to suffer the full public consequences. But the professional in me, the woman who had spent a lifetime balancing books, just wanted the ledger to be made right. At 9:47 a.m. the following morning, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from Jenna's bank, a wire transfer. The amount was staggering, a long string of numbers with a lot of zeros at the end. It was every dime they had taken, plus the 5% I had demanded. I looked at the number on the screen, and I didn't feel triumph. I felt a quiet, profound sense of order being restored. The foundation David had built for his daughter, the one they had tried to demolish, had just been rebuilt, stronger and more secure than ever before. 10 minutes later, a second buzz. An email from my lawyer. Attached was a scanned PDF. I opened it. It was the relinquishment agreement, signed in 3 shaky, desperate hands. It was over. The fallout was not a loud explosion. It was a series of quiet, devastating implosions. We witnessed them from a distance as we spent the next few days with the lawyers, surgically separating Jenna's life from theirs. Our first stop was a bright, airy law office downtown. Jenna sat across from a sharp, kind woman who walked her through the divorce papers. I watched my daughter hold the pen, her hand perfectly steady as she signed her name, ending her marriage. There were no tears, just a long, slow exhale, like a breath she had been holding for years. She was not a victim filing a complaint. She was a CEO dissolving a toxic partnership. That afternoon, while the movers were loading the last of the boxes from the studio, I overheard Mark in the living room. His voice, stripped of its usual slick confidence, was thin and reedy, cracking with panic. "What do you mean you're pulling your funding?" he pleaded into his phone. "No, it's a temporary setback. It's a misunderstanding. Don't listen to rumors." But the rumors, I was learning, had already started to fly. Their investors, the other men in polo shirts who built their fortunes on whispers and confidence, were the first rats to flee the sinking ship. The final confirmation came from an unexpected place. A few days later, Jenna and I were having lunch at a small cafe. At a nearby table, I recognized a woman from the charity gala, one of Beatrice's inner circle. She was speaking on her phone in a loud, conspiratorial whisper that was impossible to ignore. "Can you believe it?" she was saying. "The whole thing is a house of cards. My husband heard from our broker that the IRS has frozen all of Prestige's assets. Arthur is finished, utterly finished." Beatrice had to cancel her table at the symphony benefit. Can you imagine the humiliation? The woman shook her head, a delicious little shudder of schadenfreude passing through her. Beatrice's social currency, the only thing she had ever truly valued, had been declared worthless. Her name, once a badge of honor, was now just a piece of juicy gossip. The last time I saw Mark, he was standing on the porch of that big, empty house, watching the moving truck pull away with the last of Jenna's things. He looked small and lost, a ghost haunting a mausoleum. His world had been built on a series of confident assumptions that he was smarter, that his family was untouchable, and that his wife's quiet nature was a weakness he could exploit forever. He had leveraged all of it, and he had lost. As the truck turned the corner, I saw him slump against a pillar, his head in his hands. He was finally, truly, bankrupt. We didn't look back. There was nothing there for us but a monument to a collapsed lie. The ledger was closed, the books were balanced. And for the first time in years, the road ahead for my daughter was clear, open, and entirely her own. That open road led us to a place that was the complete opposite of the cold, perfect world we'd left behind. We rented a loft space for Jenna in the Arts District, a place with high ceilings, huge sun-drenched windows, and old, scarred wooden floors that smelled of turpentine and history. It wasn't a house, it was a workspace, a sanctuary, and in the middle of it, my daughter began to build her new life, thread by thread. The change in her was like watching a time-lapse video of a flower blooming. The frightened, hesitant woman who had shrunk under her husband's gaze was gone. In her place was an artist. She worked with a fierce, quiet focus, her hands, once so tentative, now moving with surety and grace. She'd put on an old, paint-splattered pair of overalls, an outfit Beatrice would have sooner died than been seen in, and she looked more beautiful and powerful than I had ever seen her. I would bring her coffee in the mornings, and just watch, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. I was no longer her rescuer, I was simply her mother again, a witness to her becoming. She was working on a new piece, her most ambitious yet. It was a massive tapestry, a swirling vortex of deep blues, angry reds, and defiant golds. It was the gala, the potluck, the sterile white kitchen, all of it woven into a story of chaos and rebirth. It was the storm, and she was no longer drowning in it. She was commanding it. We had one final, unexpected visitor. He showed up on a Tuesday morning, unannounced. I saw him from the window, hesitating on the sidewalk before entering the building. It was Mark. When he stepped into the studio, the vibrant, creative energy of the room seemed to shrink away from him. He looked terrible. The expensive suit was wrinkled, his jaw was stubbled with a multi-day growth of beard, and his eyes, once so full of slick confidence, were hollow and haunted. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, a king deposed, wandering in a land he no longer recognized. Jenna didn't stop her work. She continued weaving a brilliant gold thread through the tapestry, her back to him. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked, her voice calm and even. "Jenna," he began, his voice raspy. I just wanted to see you." He took a step further into the room, his eyes darting around at the organized chaos of her work, the raw materials of her new life. "This is where you live now? In this place?" "This is where I work," she corrected, still not looking at him. "I live here too. It's all mine." He let out a dry, rattling sound that might have been a laugh. "All yours," he repeated. He took another step, his tone shifting, the self-pity curdling into accusation. "You know, we gave you everything. A beautiful home, a life other women would kill for. We gave you a family. And you and your mother, you just blew it all up. For what? So you could play with yarn in a dusty warehouse?" He gestured around the room, his hand trembling with a rage born of pure desperation. "How could you do this to us? To the family? You ruined us." He finally ran out of steam, his chest heaving, his accusations hanging in the sunlit air. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft shugh of the shuttle as Jenna passed it through the loom. She finished the row, secured the thread, and then, finally, she turned to face him. She was not angry. She was not sad. She was perfectly, unnervingly calm. She looked at the man she had once loved, the man who had almost destroyed her, and I could see in her eyes that he no longer had any power over her. He was just a stranger with a sad, familiar story. "You didn't give me a family, Mark," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You made me a hostage in yours. You didn't give me a life. You gave me a cage and told me to be grateful for the bars." She took a step toward him, her eyes never leaving his. "You talk about what I ruined. You and your father, you took my father's memory, the one good solid thing he was able to leave me, and you tried to burn it to keep yourselves warm. You didn't think I was worth anything on my own. You thought I was just another line item on your balance sheet." She stopped in front of him. He was taller, but in that moment she towered over him. She gestured back toward the massive, swirling tapestry on the loom. "You called this my little hobby," she said, her voice still quiet, but now edged with a fine, hard strength. "A gallery in New York saw it. They called it a singular new voice in contemporary fiber art. They've commissioned a series of 6 pieces. The advance they paid me—" She paused, not for dramatic effect, but as if she were checking a number on a ledger in her head. "The advance alone is more than your father's company has netted in the last 3 years. Turns out my hobby has value, Mark. Real value." She let the words sit there, letting him absorb the full, devastating weight of them. This wasn't just about the money. It was a complete and total refutation of his entire worldview. "It's the kind of value," she finished softly, "that you have to build with your own 2 hands, the kind you can't inherit and you can't steal." Mark just stared at her, his mouth slightly open. There was nothing left to say. No argument to make. No one left to lie to. He had been audited not by me this time but by her. And he had been found wanting. He turned without another word and walked out of the studio, a man erased by the value of the woman he had tried to erase. Jenna watched him go, then turned back to her loom, picked up her shuttle and went back to work. She was building her future, and he was no longer a part of it.